All right, I'm here with Kaitlyn and Irvin to talk about GitGoat. But first, I've got this Tesla article, Ars Technica by John Timmer, which is pretty interesting. So you get a Tesla Powerwall, which is a big battery on your wall, and then Tesla has figured out a way to fill that up with electricity at 50 cents a watt and sell it back to the California power grid at $2 per unit, which I think kilowatt hour. So you make money. And the point is, there's a peak power time when PG&E will really like you to lower the load. And so you fill it in at the time when there is not a lot of demand for power, and you spend it the other time and you make money. So it sounds pretty good. I didn't see a calculation of how long it would take to pay for the thing you bought, but still, that seems like a good idea. Another thing I wonder is how often those things catch fire and blow up on you.
I mean, one of the big things,
Mhm.
if you're doing that, if you're connecting to the grid, all the equipment has to be up to spec and then some. You can't just throw together a makeshift inverter and then throw it on the grid. It really just has to be really good equipment.
There's no right to repair. You can't just build your own thing out of chicken wire.
No.
Yeah.
Well, if you do, it would have to go through quite the approval process. Which,
well, apparently, if you buy the Tesla thing, it's been through that process. That's what they say.
Exactly.
Yeah. All right. And Irvin has.
I thought chicken wire solved everything.
So did I. But I grew up before all this highfalutin fancy stuff like power. Anyway, Irvin has Ransom House getting hacked.
Yeah, well, no, not Ransom House. Ransom House is saying,
oh, they're the hackers.
That AMD is the one who was breached, and AMD says it wasn't us; it was a partner.
Oh,
so there's a lot of finger pointing in different directions as to where this info came from, and it looks like it's gonna go out for anyone to grab.
Well. If they got AMD's data from a partner, then they got AMD's data, right?
Right. It's funny to see how they're pointing fingers at each other, though.
Is it really AMD's data? Is there any doubt about that?
There is. It doesn't seem that there's a doubt whether it is or isn't. And it doesn't look like AMD is really fighting that either.
I talk about this in my management classes. This is like blaming the intern. If you hire some idiot to handle your data and they lose it, you're still responsible. Why did you hand your data to an idiot?
Yep.
All right.
Well, that's fun.
Yeah. All right. And Kaitlyn has the crash on the dark side of the moon. Very poetic.
So, right. Well, humanity has accidentally blown up part of the moon. So we have the Sydney Herald, an article written by Jamie Johnson. We actually have pictures of where it landed. So what happened is a piece of a rocket, sort of a like part of the fuselage of an old rocket. It just went wandering around in space and eventually just hit the moon and made a nice new crater. And there's an animated GIF here showing before and after where you see that there's no impact and there's an impact. And what's interesting is that there's like two impact craters like next to each other. So that means that the rocket itself was probably sort of lopsided, like two sides of a tube. Anyway, no one's taking credit for this. I mean, if I had blown up part of the moon, I would take credit. Now, however, other countries are less forthcoming. Most people believe it is China that did this. So
that's what I heard at the time. It was like a month or two ago. They said some Chinese rocket hit the moon.
Right. It was going to hit the moon. It actually did hit the moon, and now we have pictures. And people are about 99% sure that it was the China 5 T1 rocket that hit, but China's saying, no, it wasn't us. So.
Well, how many people are putting stuff that close to the moon?
I don't even think China was even trying to get close to the moon. If you are lazy and you don't care about space junk, sometimes you will just leave your old stage in orbit. Then, go on.
But an Earth orbit can't get to the moon without the addition of a whole lot more energy, right?
Well, if it gets close enough to the moon, gravity starts to happen.
Yes, but something in Earth orbit would never get close to the moon.
You would think. So, but anyway, this thing did get close to the moon, and it hit the dark side of the moon. So,
Well,
in fact, let's Google this right now. What was the China ST1 mission? So the Chang'e 5T1 mission, a robotic spacecraft that was launched to the moon. You're right. So it was a lunar mission.
right.
From
It would
China.
have to be. You're not going to get to the moon by accident.
You're unlikely to hit the moon by accident, but
Yeah.
I think this stage hit the moon by accident.
Well, sure, but it would only be because you were shooting stuff up in the vicinity of the moon.
I would assume so.
So-
I mean, it's
Yeah.
the moon is a really big target. Okay, it's not. It's
Yeah, but it's also really far away up a really high, steep gravity well.
right. So it would have to be, something in. It would have to be something in orbit that crosses the lunar orbit, which is what
Right.
happened.
And even geosynchronous orbits are not that far out, right?
Geosynchronous orbits are far out, but they're not. They're only about halfway to the moon, I think.
Okay. Well, yeah.
Geostationary orbit
Probably
height
less than that.
is 35,000 kilometers, and
Hmm.
distance to the
What is
moon.
that in freedom miles?
Oh, yeah. Oh, it's not even half that. So it is 238,000. So 38,000 versus 238. So
like
it's
1/8 of the way. That's what I
1/8
thought.
of the
So-
way. Yep.
So
Yep.
no satellite doing anything Earth-based would have any business ever getting anywhere near the moon.
Oh, yeah, no, of course. But anything going out beyond geostationary orbit does have a
Right.
chance of hitting the moon, including spent rocket stages going to Mars, going to Jupiter,
Sure.
going to even things in the inner solar system, like
And China had just put up a lunar mission to look at the dark side of the moon, so they would obviously seem to be suspect number one.
yeah. Most people, are saying that it was China. So
Yeah, and also, it's good for Americans to blame China at all times for everything. So.
Yep.
All right.
So
Well,
the man on the moon got a visitor.
that's right. Man on the moon or get hit on the head. Well, anyway, I got a startup in named Climeworks in Iceland is claiming that they are sucking a significant amount of carbon dioxide out of the air and pumping it underground and binding it to rocks to get rid of it. And they are projecting that they can actually remove a significant amount. What they say is they're going to remove millions of tons of CO2 per year by 2030 and 1 billion tons per year by 2050. Although they're going to need a lot of money to do that. But the point is that would actually matter because the amount of CO2 we dumped in the air last year was 36 billion tons. So taking 1 billion out is like 3% of it, which is a whole lot more than I thought they would ever achieve. So anyway, I don't know if they're just making ridiculous extrapolations of their numbers, but this is the first time I've ever heard anybody make the remotest claim that this thing of sucking CO2 out of the air might ever amount to enough to make a difference. I certainly hope they're right. That would mean all you have to do is build 30 or 40 of these things and you'd actually clean up the air. In the meantime, they're doing penny ante stuff like selling CO2 for people to put in soda pop to like recover money. They're going to have to scale up beyond that scale of finance to make it work. Anyway, Irvin's got the glorious GitGoat that gives us our name today.
Yes, GitGoat looks like it's along the same lines as like WebGoat and Kubernetes Goat and all those others that creates a vulnerable vulnerable GitHub repo that you can use to see what happens when you put up things that you shouldn't with like API keys and whatnot or tokens.
Yep. And probably previous commits with secrets in them and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it sounds like a great training tool.
Yes, good training tool.
Yep. All right. And Kaitlyn has got more dirt for China.
yeah, China bad. Boo. So TechSpot has an article talking about the Minority Report for China. And this is by Adrian Potoraka. Thank you, Adrian. So the Minority Report was a movie about a crime department that would try to stop crimes before they happened. So it was sort of like future crimes department. And they had these oracles that would see the future And then when it thinks that a crime would happen, they would send out the police to stop it before that crime took place. And China apparently wants to make this a reality. And this is sort of a no doubt, of course, position from China. We all expected this to happen. China is going to use AI modeling to predict who's going to become a criminal and what they're going to do based on their surveillance state, and then try to be proactive in stopping those people by arresting them before they commit crimes. We'll see how this works. They don't have the technology yet. What they're looking for is people or companies to make bids to provide the technology. So they're very interested. They're willing to spend the money on this. And if it did exist, they would put it up in a heartbeat, which is not so good for the Chinese people, I think.
Yeah, it seems to me like it's something that would work if you have a very rigid society where people are supposed to do the normal thing, and you detect anybody that is being abnormal is about what you can do.
Yeah. I mean, that's very scary for someone like me, who is by all means law abiding, just not conformist.
Well, half of that I'd agree with. Yeah. But anyway, yeah. Well, that's China. They got no compunctions about the blowback or anything over there. All right. And so anyway, the Supreme Court continues to be dumpster fire. After overturning Roe versus Wade, and I thought Roe versus Wade was an exemplary decision because the 5 far right ones just said we have to overturn Roe versus Wade. Roberts said, no, we just need to make a small move here. We're just going to let this one state lower the time limit for abortion from 20 weeks to 15 weeks and not overturn Roe versus Wade because of stare decisis. You're not supposed to make radical, sudden changes and rock the boat and trouble society. You're supposed to make gentle course corrections up here at the Supreme Court, and the 3 liberals wouldn't have it. And so this shows what I think you can see. If you're in the middle, what you accomplish is everybody hates you. Everybody on the left wants to fight and go to the left. Everybody on the right wants to fight and go to the right. There's a few people in the middle, like Liz Cheney and Andrew Yang, and all you get is you get stoned by both sides when people are bruising for a fight. So anyway, I like the description of the Supreme Court that Ezra Klein said. He said, they said, here's how it works. Forget the stare decisis. We got the keys to this thing and we're going to drive it like we stole it. And that's what they're doing. They're just ramming America back to 1962 as fast as possible. So in addition to overturning Roe versus Wade, they have made it so states cannot limit the carry of guns like New York and California do. They have made it so that the bigoted map in Louisiana that freezes Black people out of voting that was already stopped is restored and they can use it. They have made it so you can have prayer at school events where people are pressured to join as violating the separation of church and state. And any day now, they're expected to declare that the EPA cannot restrict climate emissions. So they're really trying to roll us back to 1962. And so it is kind of amazing and horrible. And the question is, when will there be any pushback? And I guess we may see there will come presumably some point when Democrats get so mad they actually vote, and then they might try to do something. But it's kind of hard to see what you can do when the Supreme Court is against you. That's a problem because anything you do will eventually get pushed up to the Supreme Court. But anyway, we continue to live in interesting times as our society sort of splits in half and collapses around us. But the private sector is doing well. It's just our government that doesn't seem to work anymore. Anyway.
I mean, it should be noted that centrism is not necessarily a enlightened position.
Oh no, it's the way you make everybody hate you.
Right. Well, I mean, what I mean is that it's not necessarily the best position. There's a fallacy of being in the middle where, one side says this, one side says the other. Therefore, the truth must lie in the middle. And this, of course, is not true at all.
Oh, no. And in politics, I don't think there's hardly ever any truth at all. The only point is, if you actually wanted the nation to stay intact, you would have to try to find positions in the middle that both sides can tolerate. But that doesn't seem to be possible anymore. The two sides do not seem to have any overlap.
I think the issue here isn't necessarily opposing views, that you have one side saying that, that believes this and one side that believes that, and we need more people in the middle. I don't think that's the case. I think what we need is to lower the temperature, listen to both sides and just be civil, and you can still have politicians that want socialism, and you can still have politicians that are, very big, anti-government, capitalist, libertarian, for life people. And if they just calm down and talk to each other, that would be great.
Okay,
Well,
that sounds like a big old fantasy, Kaitlyn.
it does. I mean,
The
calming
Civil
down.
War is first before we sit down and hug it out.
I mean, the point is they have sincere grievances against each other. They're not in the mood to sit down and talk calmly. They're in the mood to fight.
Yeah, and unfortunately, that's the problem. It's not that there's no one in the middle. It's that these two sides are they want to fight. And if they didn't want to fight, it would be fine.
Well, that's the human condition, right? That's what Jesus and everybody else, all the enlightened people said, if you guys stop fighting so much, things will be a lot better. And that's true, but we don't seem to be programmed that way. Anyway, Irvin has found out that the new Mac is slower than the old Mac. So what's up with that?
Yeah, what's up with that? Looks like in the MacBook Pro, the cheaper one, they put slower SSDs.
Was it the
This is the
supply chain?
M2.
Maybe they couldn't get the good ones because of supply chain problems?
But it looks like if you get the more expensive ones, then you have the faster SSD. So how does that make sense?
Yeah, why would you bother making a product that is inferior to the old one? Wouldn't seem like you'd be able to have anybody buy it.
I will say I did make the mistake of putting together a computer recently, and I decided that I would have the fastest SSDs available with my PCI 5 lanes and everything like that. It doesn't really make that big of a difference in everyday computing.
Mhm.
It really doesn't. It's supposedly, if I were to transfer a huge file, it would go a lot faster, but I haven't noticed a big difference. And this is like, top of the line SSDs.
Well, it would only be if you have a write limited application, which I guess graphics processing maybe.
I
Or
mean,
big
if you're
movies or something.
copying, if you're copying large files or something, it could be fast. But like I said, I'm running the fastest SSDs in RAID 0, and I'm not seeing a huge improvement in, or that big of an improvement. There is an improvement over what I had before, but it's not a deal breaker.
Yeah, well, this is a fundamental engineering principle that if you have several steps, it's the slowest one that limits it, and speeding up the others doesn't help.
Right.
Yeah. Oh, good.
So I don't think most end users are going to be, complaining too much about the SSDs, unless it's a huge problem, like they're slower than platter disks. But I don't think that's the case.
Well, that makes sense. And
they're
the
not going to
process.
be spotted in platter.
So is the Irvin? Irvin, is the processor faster? Because then an average user might experience a performance improvement, even though the SSD is slower.
Right. The M2 is faster than the M1.
Oh, okay. So maybe they just decided to settle for a slower SSD to save money, and because they figured, like Kaitlyn, that the user would not notice the slowdown.
Right.
That might
Until
make
somebody
sense.
tested it and saw it and told the world.
Yeah. Well, all right. Good. And Kaitlyn has information about shootings.
Yeah, so this should come as a no surprise to anyone, but NBC has an article talking about by Chantal da Silva talking about school shootings in 2020 and 2021. And unfortunately, school shootings have been the highest on record. So even during the pandemic, when people were staying at home from school, the United States still experienced record shootings. There were 93 incidents recorded in 2020 and 2021, 43 fatalities and 50 injuries. So
now that you mention it, weren't all the schools shut? How could we possibly have that happen?
Yeah, no, that's what I was thinking too. But apparently that is because, well, there was some time in 2020 before the pandemic, and then things started to open up again in 2021. And you would think that school shootings would go down, but that's not the case at all. It's been,
so that would suggest that next year when the schools are open, we'll have a lot more.
Maybe we'll see. The pandemic put a lot of stress on everyone. And for children that were at risk for this kind of behavior, it usually could have pushed them over the edge. But yeah, we'll see. There's still going to be lasting trauma from the pandemic that, an entire generation will need to deal with.
And apparently from the shootings, I saw an article where they said, an average teenager has been to like 50 shooting drills. And that doesn't sound good for you.
It's not good. It's not good for the kids. I mean, they go to school and they're reminded that at any moment it could be a war zone. And that kind of stress affects the development of neurological structures. So
I would think so. And especially this kind of shooting, I think, is much worse than, say, if you were in an actual war and there was some kind of enemy attacking you, there'd at least be some sense to it. This craziness that some random person will just go nuts and shoot people, it seems like that would be deeply unsettling.
it is. And unfortunately, this is a sort of a collective trauma that entire generation needs to deal with, or simply ignore and dive into unhealthy coping mechanisms like hyper-consumerism.
And conspiracy theories.
Yes.
Yep. All right. Well, I found another thing right before we started that I thought was very interesting, although I don't know much about it. There is a vulnerability in elliptic curve cryptography. And I heard about this in one of my books. If there's two parts to an elliptic curve cryptograph, there's a random number and there's a public and private key. And when you make a signature, you involve a random number. But if you were able to get it to sign two things with the same random number, but different public keys, you can trivially deduce the private key. And it turns out that a whole bunch of popular libraries, like 40 of them, make this mistake. They expose an API where you can make API calls specifying these two parameters separately, so you can request two signatures with different public keys, but the same random number. And that's, of course, just a flaw in the programming. It should generate the random number without asking you for it every time, or something like that. Anyway, so it turns out there's a ton of these unsafe libraries, including big ones like Rust and C++ and C and Python and so on. So, and they notified them, and none of them have fixed it yet, except one. So in principle, they're leaking out private keys. This is sort of a scary thing, sort of like Heartbleed. Depending on exactly how easy that attack is. They don't provide information about exactly how easy it is and proof of concept code or something, but it sounds like a pretty easy attack. So all these cryptographic libraries need to update.
Cool.
Yeah. Anyway, that's it for this one, and we'll be back on Friday.